In the summer of 2011, a 40-year-old American institution closed its doors forever. No fire, no scandal, no fraud, just silence across 650 stores in 45 states all at once. Borders Group, the second largest bookstore chain in the United States. $4 billion in annual revenue. 19,500 employees who showed up to work one morning and never came back. And here's what nobody tells you. Borders didn't die because people stopped reading. It didn't die because the market turned against it. It died because of one decision, made a full decade before the bankruptcy filing, that handed its most dangerous competitor a master key to everything Borders knew about its own customers. They didn't get robbed, they handed over the keys themselves. This is not a story about books. This is a story about what happens when a company looks at the future, decides it's too complicated to deal with, and outsources the problem to the exact company that will use it to destroy them. Ann Arbor, Michigan, 1971. Two brothers, Tom and Louis Borders, open a small used bookstore near the University of Michigan campus. No grand vision, no venture capital, no 5-year plan, just a genuine love of books and a simple idea. Organize them better than anyone else had ever bothered to. At a time when most bookstores stocked whatever sold fastest and shelved the rest by accident, the Borders brothers did something radical. They built a proprietary inventory system, hand-coded, obsessively detailed, that tracked exactly which books were selling, in which regions, to which kinds of readers. For the first time, a bookstore actually knew what it had, what it needed, and what its customers wanted before they even walked in the door. It worked. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Borders quietly expanded, and then, in 1992, Kmart acquired the chain, and the real acceleration began. New locations opened across the country. Not small storefronts, but massive, cathedral-like superstores. 20,000 square feet, 30,000 titles on the shelves, a cafe in the corner, armchairs scattered throughout, jazz playing softly overhead. This was not a place to buy a book and leave. This was a destination. People came to Borders the way they came to a neighborhood they loved. They spent hours there. They brought their kids on Saturday mornings. They discovered authors they'd never heard of because a staff member had handwritten a recommendation card and tucked it into the shelf. In an era before algorithms told you what to read next, Borders did it. With taste, with personality, with a human touch that no website had yet figured out how to replicate. By the mid-1990s, Borders was a genuine cultural force. Annual revenues climbed toward $2 billion. The company went public in 1995. Analysts loved it. Consumers loved it. The future looked limitless. And then came the thing nobody at Borders wanted to think too hard about. In 1994, the same year Borders was riding high, a 30-year-old Wall Street analyst named Jeff Bezos drove a moving truck from New York to Seattle. He pulled over on the highway to write a business plan on a legal pad. By the time he reached Washington State, the outline for Amazon.com was done. He chose books first, not because he loved them, though he did, but because books were the perfect product for the internet. Lightweight, standardized, easily described, infinite variety, no fitting room required. Bezos launched Amazon in July 1995 out of his garage in Bellevue. In the first month, the site shipped books to all 50 states and 45 countries. Revenue in year 1, $500,000. Year 2, $8 million. Year 3, $148 million. The trajectory was not subtle. Back at Borders headquarters in Ann Arbor, the reaction was measured, polite, unconvinced. The executives looked at Amazon and saw a niche operation for people who didn't have a real bookstore nearby. They looked at their own packed superstores, their loyal customer base, their $3 billion in annual revenue by the late 1990s, and they made a calculation. We are the experience. The internet cannot replicate what we have built. They weren't wrong about the experience. Borders really had built something special, something warm and human and irreplaceable. They were just catastrophically wrong about everything else. Because while Borders was busy protecting the world it had already built, Amazon was quietly building the world that was coming next. And in the year 2001, Borders would make a decision that didn't just fail to compete with that world, it funded it. Funded, let's set the scene. It's 2001. The dot-com bubble has just burst. Billions of dollars in internet valuations have evaporated overnight. Pets.com is gone. Webvan is gone. Cosmo is gone. Every few weeks, another startup that was supposed to change the world quietly shuts its servers down. And inside Borders Group headquarters, the mood is something close to vindication. See, Borders had watched the dot-com boom with skepticism. They'd seen the hysteria. They'd watched competitors pour money into websites that burned cash and delivered nothing. And now, with the wreckage of the internet bubble scattered across the business pages, the executives at Borders felt confirmed in what they'd always suspected, that the internet was a fad for speculators, not a genuine threat to a company with real stores, real inventory, and real customers who kept coming back. So when the question of Borders.com came up, what to do with the company's online retail presence, the answer felt obvious. Outsource it. Why build and maintain an expensive e-commerce platform when a specialist could do it cheaper? Why distract the company's attention from what it did best? Running great physical stores with the messy complexity of warehouse logistics and digital infrastructure? Let someone else handle the internet. Borders would focus on what it knew, that someone else was Amazon. In 2001, Borders signed a deal that handed Amazon full operational control of Borders.com. Amazon would process the orders. Amazon would manage the inventory. Amazon would handle customer service. Amazon would fulfill the shipments. Borders would collect a percentage of sales and put its name on the storefront. On paper, it looked like a reasonable cost-sharing arrangement. In reality, it was an intelligence transfer of staggering proportions. Think about what was actually happening every single day that contract was in effect. A Borders customer, loyal, book-loving, demographically valuable, goes online to buy a novel. They type in Borders.com. They search, browse, select, purchase. And every single data point from that interaction flows directly into Amazon's systems. Not Borders, Amazon's. What genres they favored, what price points triggered a purchase, what time of day they shopped, what they searched for and didn't find, what they abandoned in their cart, what they bought twice. Amazon wasn't just fulfilling orders. Amazon was building the most detailed portrait of the American book-buying public that had ever existed. And they were building it using Borders' own customers on Borders' own branded website, funded by Borders' own revenue share. Jeff Bezos understood something in 2001 that Borders' leadership simply did not. Data is not a byproduct of retail. Data is the asset. The transactions are just the mechanism for collecting it. Borders treated the internet as a distribution channel, a convenience feature, a secondary revenue stream, something you could contract out like janitorial services or payroll processing. Amazon treated every click, every search, every purchase as a piece of intelligence that compounded in value over time. And here is the part that makes this story genuinely hard to stomach. The contract lasted until 2008, 7 years. For 7 years, Borders voluntarily fed its most valuable asset, its customer relationships, into a system owned and operated by its most dangerous competitor. By the time Borders finally ended the arrangement and launched its own website, Amazon knew the American book buyer better than any company on earth. It had the data, it had the logistics, it had the pricing models, it had the recommendation engine. Borders had a website that launched 6 years too late, built on a foundation of zero proprietary customer knowledge. There's a word for what Borders did in 2001. It's not incompetence exactly. It's not laziness. It's something more specific and more dangerous. It's the blindness that comes from being comfortable. They had the stores, they had the customers, they had the brand, and they looked at the future, decided it was someone else's problem, and signed a contract that made their greatest competitor into the expert on their own business. The door was now open, and Amazon walked straight through it. Here's a question we're sitting with. If you watched a competitor grow from 0 to $1 billion in revenue in under 5 years, in your exact industry, selling your exact product, what would you do? Borders' answer through the early 2000s was essentially, keep doing what we're doing. And for a while, that answer didn't look insane. The stores were still full, the cafes were still busy, holiday seasons were still strong. If you walked into a Borders superstore in 2003 or 2004, it still felt like a thriving business. Warm, crowded, alive. But underneath the surface, the ground was shifting in ways that Borders leadership either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. The music industry was the first warning sign, and Borders missed it completely. In 2003, Apple launched the iTunes Store. For 99 cents, you could buy a single song, legally, instantly, without leaving your couch. Within a year, iTunes had sold over 100 million songs. The message was unambiguous. Consumers would choose digital convenience over physical product every single time the option was available, and they would do it at scale, and they would do it fast. Borders responded by doubling down on its CD and DVD sections. This was not a minor miscalculation. At its peak, music and video accounted for roughly a third of Borders' in-store revenue. As digital downloads began eating into physical media sales year after year, Borders kept allocating floor space, inventory dollars, and staff hours to a category that was structurally, irreversibly declining. They were rearranging the furniture in a room that was quietly filling with water. Meanwhile, the leadership situation was becoming its own crisis. Between 2004 and 2009, Borders cycled through 4 different CEOs. 4. In 5 years. Each one arrived with a new strategy, a new set of priorities, a new organizational restructuring. Each one inherited the mess left by the last and spent precious months simply trying to understand what they'd walked into before the board lost patience and the cycle started over. There is no way to execute a long-term digital transformation, the kind that requires years of investment, cultural change, and strategic patience, when your top leadership turns over every 14 months. And then came 2007. In November of that year, Amazon introduced the Kindle, a portable device that could store hundreds of books, download new titles in under 60 seconds, and fit in a coat pocket. The first generation sold out in 5.5 hours. Amazon didn't restock it for 5 months because demand so completely outran supply. The e-reader era had arrived, not as a rumor, not as a prototype, as a product that real consumers were buying and loving and telling their friends about. Barnes & Noble saw it. Within 2 years, they launched the Nook, their own e-reader, their own digital ecosystem, their own answer to the Kindle. It wasn't perfect, but it existed. It was a bet on the future, made in time to matter. Borders did not make that bet. There was internal discussion, there were proposals, there were meetings, but the combination of revolving door leadership, a balance sheet already weakening under the weight of long-term retail leases, and a corporate culture that had spent a decade telling itself that physical experience was the moat, all of it conspired to produce the same outcome, over and over again. Inaction. By the time 2008 arrived, Borders was carrying over $350 million in long-term debt. It was locked into leases on more than 600 large-format stores, spaces that made sense when foot traffic was growing and became crushing fixed costs the moment it started declining. It had no e-reader. It had no proprietary digital platform. It had no meaningful online presence. It had beautiful stores and a world that was learning, rapidly and permanently, that it didn't need to leave the house to get what Borders sold. The recession that hit in 2008 didn't create Borders problems. It just removed the last thing that had been keeping those problems hidden. The bill was coming due. September 2008. Lehman Brothers collapses, credit markets freeze, consumer spending falls off a cliff. Across the United States, retailers begin bracing for the worst holiday season in decades. For a healthy company, a recession is painful. Revenues drop, margins compress, hard decisions get made. But a healthy company survives it, restructures, and comes out the other side. Borders was not a healthy company. By the time the financial crisis hit, Borders had been quietly hemorrhaging for years. The digital mistakes, the leadership instability, the overexpansion, none of it had been fatal on its own. But together, layered on top of each other across nearly a decade, they had left the company uniquely, catastrophically exposed to exactly the kind of shock that 2008 delivered. Here's what Borders' balance sheet actually looked like when the recession arrived. The company was carrying over $350 million in long-term debt. It was locked into leases on more than 600 stores, leases that ran for years, sometimes decades, signed during the expansion era when every new location felt like a growth investment. Those leases didn't care about recessions. They didn't care about declining foot traffic or falling same-store sales. The rent was due every month regardless, and the amounts were enormous. A single large-format Borders superstore could run anywhere from $1 million to $3 million per year in occupancy costs alone. Multiply that across 600 locations. Then imagine your sales dropping 15, 20, 25% year over year. The math becomes not just difficult, but genuinely unsurvivable. And it got worse. As Borders' financial position deteriorated, its relationships with publishers, the companies that actually supplied the books on its shelves, began to fracture. Publishers work on credit terms. A retailer orders inventory, sells it, and pays the publisher within an agreed window. When that window starts to slip, when payments come in late, or in partial amounts, or accompanied by requests for extended terms, publishers notice. By 2009 and into 2010, Borders was falling behind on payments to its publishers. And publishers, watching the company's stock price crater and its debt load grow, began responding the only way they rationally could, by tightening credit terms, demanding faster payment, or in some cases pulling back supply entirely. Think about what that means for a bookstore. Your core product is books. Your ability to stock books depends on your relationships with publishers. The moment those relationships start to break down, you can no longer fully stock your shelves. The moment your shelves are no longer fully stocked, your stores become less worth visiting. The moment your stores become less worth visiting, your sales fall further. The moment your sales fall further, you fall further behind on payments to publishers. It was a death spiral, and by 2010, it was spinning fast. The stock chart told the story with brutal clarity. In 2004, Borders shares traded at around $20. By 2008, they had fallen to under $5. By mid-2010, the stock was trading at less than $1, which is the market's way of saying it no longer believes in a company's survival. Attempts were made to find a way out. There were talks about a potential merger with Barnes & Noble, which would have at least combined the two chains' resources and eliminated a major competitor in a shrinking market. Those talks collapsed in 2008 without a deal. There were conversations with private equity firms about a buyout. Nothing materialized. There were strategic plans and cost-cutting initiatives and new loyalty programs and all the standard instruments a struggling retailer reaches for when the walls are closing in. None of it was enough, because none of it addressed the actual problem. The actual problem was not the recession. The recession was the accelerant. The actual problem was that Borders had spent a decade making decisions, or refusing to make decisions, that left it with no digital business, no proprietary customer data, no e-reader, no meaningful online platform, and a cost structure built for a world of endlessly growing physical retail that had simply stopped being the world anyone lived in. By the end of 2010, the question was no longer whether Borders would survive. The question was how much longer the end could be delayed. The answer, it turned out, was about 6 weeks. Before we watch Borders fall apart completely, we need to stop and answer a question that makes the whole story sharper. Was this inevitable? Was the collapse of a large physical bookstore chain simply the unavoidable outcome of the digital age? Was Borders just a casualty of forces too large for any company to resist? The way travel agencies disappeared when Expedia arrived, or video rental stores vanished when Netflix figured out streaming? The answer is no. And we know it's no because of what happened to Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble faced every single threat that Borders faced. Amazon, the Kindle, declining physical media, the shift to digital books, the 2008 recession, all of it. Barnes & Noble was not operating in a different market or a different era. They were in the same stores, selling the same products, fighting the same competitor, navigating the same technological disruption. And they're still here, not thriving in the way they once were, The entire physical book retail industry is smaller than it used to be, and nobody pretends otherwise. But Barnes& Noble exists. It has stores. It has customers. It is a functioning business. In 2019, it was acquired by Elliott Advisors and brought in a new CEO, James Daunt, who had previously rescued the British bookseller Waterstones from near collapse. Under his leadership, Barnes& Noble has actually been opening new stores. So what did Barnes& Noble do that Borders didn't? The first and most important answer is that Barnes & Noble never outsourced its online retail to Amazon. From the beginning, they built and controlled their own website. They made the investment. They absorbed the cost and complexity of running a digital storefront. And in doing so, they retained something Borders gave away entirely: a direct relationship with their online customers and the data that relationship generated. That decision compounded in value every year. By the time e-commerce became a genuine battleground, Barnes & Noble had years of online retail experience and customer data that Borders simply did not have. They weren't ahead of Amazon, nobody was, but they were in the fight. Borders wasn't even in the building. The second answer is the Nook. In October 2009, Barnes & Noble launched its first e-reader. It wasn't as polished as the Kindle. The software had quirks. The ecosystem was thinner. But it existed, and that existence meant something crucial. It meant Barnes & Noble was telling its customers, explicitly and in hardware form, "We are a place where you can buy books in the format the future is moving toward. We are not going to make you leave us to go digital." The Nook never beat the Kindle, but it didn't need to. It needed to give Barnes & Noble's loyal customers a reason to stay inside the Barnes & Noble ecosystem when they made the transition to digital reading. And for a meaningful segment of the market, it did exactly that. Barnes & Noble also made harder, less glamorous decisions that Borders resisted. They closed underperforming stores rather than carrying them. They renegotiated leases aggressively. They managed their balance sheet with enough discipline to stay solvent through the recession years. None of this was exciting. None of it made headlines. It was just the unglamorous work of keeping a company alive long enough to adapt. The contrast between the two companies is not a story of genius versus stupidity. The leaders of Borders were not fools. They were experienced retail executives who had built genuinely impressive businesses. The contrast is subtler and in some ways more instructive than that. It is a story about what happens when a company's identity becomes its blindness. Borders believed, deeply, institutionally, at the level of corporate DNA, that the physical bookstore experience was the product, that the cafe and the armchairs and the knowledgeable staff and the 30,000 titles on the shelves were so valuable, so irreplaceable, that customers would always choose them over the convenience of a screen. Barnes & Noble believed that too, but they also hedged. They also built the digital option. They also kept one foot in the future while the other stayed planted in the present. Borders put both feet in the past and called it commitment. February 16, 2011. That is the date Borders Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. The filing listed $1,029 billion in assets against $1,29 billion in liabilities. On paper, those numbers looked almost balanced. In practice, the assets were largely illiquid: store fixtures, inventory, long-term leases on retail space that nobody wanted, and the liabilities were immediate, pressing, and growing by the day. The list of creditors in the bankruptcy filing read like a who's who of the publishing world. Penguin Group was owed $41.1 million. Hachette Book Group, $36.9 million. Simon & Schuster, $33 million. Random House, $33.5 million. Warner Brothers, $41.9 million. In total, Borders owed its top 30 creditors over $400 million. These were not abstract accounting entries. These were publishers and studios that had shipped product to Borders stores in good faith and had not been paid. Some of them had been waiting months. A few had been quietly extending credit long past the point where their own internal risk models said they should have stopped. Because the alternative, a Borders collapse, was bad for the entire publishing ecosystem. Now the collapse was happening anyway, and they were in line with everyone else. The initial Chapter 11 filing came with a restructuring plan. Borders announced it would close 226 stores immediately, roughly a third of its total locations. An attempt to reorganize the remaining 399 into a leaner, more viable business. The company hired a restructuring advisory firm. It began negotiations with landlords to reduce lease obligations. It looked from the outside like a company trying to survive, but the math kept not working. The store closings triggered liquidation sales, the kind with giant yellow signs in the windows and crowds of bargain hunters picking through shelving units and cash wrap counters. Customers who hadn't visited a Borders in years suddenly showed up to buy books at 40% off. There was something painfully ironic about it. The stores were more crowded in their final weeks than they had been in years, but the revenue went to paying down debt, not to funding a recovery. Meanwhile, potential buyers circled without landing. There was interest from various private equity groups and retail operators. Discussions were held. Term sheets were floated. One bid came in from a group that included former Borders CEO George Jones, a last-ditch effort by someone who genuinely believed the brand still had value worth saving. The bids were evaluated, negotiated, and ultimately rejected or withdrawn. By July 2011, it was over. On July 18, 2011, Borders received court approval to liquidate its remaining 399 stores. There would be no restructured company, no scaled-down version, no second act, just the end. The liquidation sales that followed were, depending on your perspective, either deeply sad or deeply strange. Entire store interiors were sold off. The shelving, the cafe equipment, the registers, the armchairs that customers had spent thousands of hours reading in. Everything carried a price tag. Everything went. The final stores closed in September 2011. 19,500 employees lost their jobs. Not through a gradual wind down, not through a managed transition with severance packages and outplacement services funded by a solvent company. Through a bankruptcy liquidation that left most of them with whatever state unemployment benefits they qualified for and whatever unused vacation pay the estate could cover. Many of them had worked at Borders for 10, 15, 20 years. They had built their professional lives inside those stores. They knew the inventory. They knew their regulars. They had written those handwritten recommendation cards and helped customers find books that changed their lives. None of that protected them from what a decade of strategic failure at the executive level had set in motion. That is the part of this story that gets lost when we talk about Borders as a business case study, as a lesson in digital disruption and strategic myopia, and the dangers of outsourcing your core competency to a competitor. The clean, analytical language of business school makes it easy to skip over the human dimension entirely. But 19,500 people is not an abstraction. Those were real careers, real livelihoods, real lives built around a company that the people running it had slowly, systematically, and in some cases almost willfully driven into the ground. The lights went out for the last time in September 2011. 40 years. Gone. At this point in the story, it's tempting to assign blame cleanly. The executives were arrogant. The board was asleep. The strategy was wrong. 19,500 people paid the price. Case closed. But the honest version of this story is more complicated than that. And the more complicated version is actually more useful, because the clean version lets everyone watching off the hook too easily. So let's steelman the defense for a moment. In 2001, when Borders signed the Amazon deal, the dot-com bubble had just collapsed. The conventional wisdom, not just at Borders, but across the entire retail industry, was that physical stores had proven their durability and internet-only businesses had proven their fragility. The graveyard of failed e-commerce startups was fresh and highly visible. The idea that you should pour tens of millions of dollars into building your own digital infrastructure in that climate, in that moment, was not the obvious call. It was a genuinely contested strategic question, and the outsourcing logic, taken on its own terms, was not irrational. Companies outsource non-core functions all the time. Airlines don't build their own reservation software. Retailers don't run their own shipping networks. The principle of focusing on your core competency and contracting out the rest is not inherently flawed. Borders applied it incorrectly, catastrophically incorrectly, but the framework itself is standard business practice. You could also argue that the speed of digital disruption in the book industry was not fully predictable in 2001. E-readers were still theoretical. The idea that a meaningful portion of the reading public would abandon physical books entirely for digital devices was, at that point, more science fiction than business forecast. These are real points. They deserve acknowledgement. But here's where the defense starts to fall apart. The Amazon deal may have been defensible in 2001. What happened in the years that followed was not. By 2004, iTunes had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that digital distribution would cannibalize physical media at scale and at speed. That signal was available to everyone. Borders' music and video sections should have been a five-alarm warning. Instead, they were maintained, invested in, and defended. By 2005, Amazon's trajectory was no longer ambiguous. The company had passed $8 billion in annual revenue. It was not a niche player. It was not a dot-com survivor clinging to relevance. It was the dominant force in online retail, growing faster than any comparable company in history, and it was doing so largely on the back of its book business, the exact business Borders was in. By 2007, the Kindle made the future of reading concrete and immediate. This was not a prediction anymore. This was a product that consumers were buying in enormous numbers. Right now, today, the window for a strategic response was not closed. Barnes & Noble proved that, but it was closing, and every month without action made it narrower. And yet at Borders, the pattern held. Meetings were held. Presentations were made. Proposals were drafted and revised and tabled and revisited. And the outcome over and over again was the same. Not yet, not this quarter. Let's see how the numbers develop. There is a specific kind of organizational failure that produces that outcome. It is not stupidity. It is not even simple arrogance, though arrogance is part of it. It is something more structural, the way large, successful institutions develop immune systems against change. When a company has been successful doing things a certain way for a long time, that way of doing things becomes embedded in everything. In the incentive structures, in the hiring criteria, in the metrics that get reported to the board, in the language people use to describe what the company is and does. Change stops being a strategic option and starts being a threat to identity. At Borders, the identity was the physical bookstore. Everything else was noise. And that identity, built over decades of genuine success, became the thing that made it impossible to see clearly when the world moved. The leaders of Borders were not villains. They were people who were very good at running the world that used to exist. The tragedy is that they never figured out how to become people who were good at running the world that was coming. Here's where the story stops being history. Because everything we've just walked through, the comfort, the denial, the outsourced future, the identity that became a blindness, none of it is unique to a bookstore chain in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the early 2000s. The specific details are Borders. The pattern belongs to everyone. And right now, today, there are companies sitting in the exact position Borders sat in during 2001. They have strong brands, loyal customers, real revenue, a leadership team that has been successful long enough to trust its own instincts deeply, perhaps too deeply. And somewhere in the competitive landscape, there is an Amazon-shaped thing growing at a rate that the quarterly reports don't yet fully reflect. The question is not whether you recognize Borders in this story. The question is whether you recognize anyone you know. Let's start with the most obvious candidate. Traditional retail, department stores, specialty chains, any physical commerce built on the assumption that foot traffic is a stable foundation, has been living the Borders story in slow motion for 15 years. Sears, J.C. Penney, Bed Bath & Beyond, each one a version of the same film, each one with its own specific chapter, where the Amazon deal got signed, where the Kindle launched and nobody responded, where the debt load became unsurvivable. But retail is the easy example. The more interesting ones are less obvious. Look at the television industry in 2010. Netflix had been mailing DVDs since 1998 and had just launched its streaming service in 2007. The major networks and cable companies looked at Netflix the way Borders looked at Amazon in 2001. as a niche product for a specific kind of consumer, interesting but not existential. They licensed their content to Netflix for fees that seemed generous at the time. They handed over their libraries. They funded the competitor that would spend the next decade dismantling their business model. Sound familiar? Look at the taxi industry in 2012, the year Uber began its serious national expansion. The incumbent players had regulatory protection, established infrastructure, and customer bases built over decades. They had everything Borders had, and they responded to the threat the way Borders responded to Amazon, with a combination of lobbying, denial, and the institutional conviction that what they had built was simply too embedded in daily life to be replaced. Look at traditional banking. Look at travel agencies. Look at print journalism. Look at any industry where the dominant players built their identities around a physical or institutional presence that digital infrastructure has spent the last 20 years learning to replicate at a fraction of the cost. In every one of those industries, there were companies that saw the shift coming and adapted, imperfectly, expensively, sometimes painfully, but in time. And there were companies that saw the same shift coming and decided, for reasons that felt entirely rational from inside the building, that it didn't apply to them. The ones that decided it didn't apply to them are the borders of their sectors. Now bring it closer. If you run a business, any business, there are three questions that the border story forces onto the table. First, who are you feeding? Are there partnerships, contracts, or platform dependencies in your business where a third party is learning more about your customers than you are? Are you outsourcing something that you've told yourself is non-core, but is actually foundational? Second, what signal are you explaining away? Every company facing disruption has data points that don't fit the comfortable narrative. The question is not whether those signals exist. They always exist. The question is what the organization does with them. Does discomfort produce inquiry, or does it produce rationalization? Third, is your identity protecting you or blinding you? The things that made Borders great, the experience, the curation, the physical presence, were real. They just couldn't be allowed to become the reason not to build what came next. These are not abstract questions. They have specific answerable versions inside every organization. Borders had the data, Borders had the time, Borders had the resources, at least in the early years, to respond. They just never found a way past the question that killed them. And that question was the simplest one of all. If what we've built is this good, why would anything ever replace it? Every collapsed company leaves something behind. Not the stores, not the brand, not the stock certificates that became worthless in a bankruptcy court in New York. Something more durable than any of that. The specific extractable lessons that survive the wreckage and stay useful long after the last Borders location closed its doors in September 2011. There are three of them, and they are worth saying slowly. The first lesson, never outsource what you don't yet understand. This sounds simple. It isn't. The instinct to outsource complexity is not a bad instinct. Organizations have finite capacity. Specialization creates efficiency. The entire logic of modern business is built on the idea that you focus on what you do best and contract out the rest. The problem comes when you outsource something before you understand what it actually is. In 2001, Borders looked at e-commerce and saw a logistics problem, a fulfillment challenge, a technology headache that someone else could manage more cheaply and efficiently than an Ann Arbor bookstore chain had any right to expect to manage itself. What Borders didn't see, what it fundamentally failed to understand, was that e-commerce was not a logistics problem. It was a data problem. It was a customer relationship problem. It was the mechanism through which the next decade of retail competition would be decided. You cannot outsource something you don't understand and expect to get it back once you figure out what it was. By the time Borders understood what it had given away, Amazon had spent 7 years turning that understanding into an insurmountable competitive advantage. The rule that follows from this is uncomfortable but precise. If you don't understand something well enough to know whether outsourcing it is safe, you don't understand it well enough to outsource it. The correct response to complexity you don't yet comprehend is to comprehend it. not to hand it to someone else and hope the contract protects you. The second lesson, customer data is not a byproduct. It is the asset. This was the core of what Amazon understood in 2001 that Borders did not. Every transaction a customer makes with your business is a data point. Every search query, every abandoned cart, every category they browse and product they don't buy, all of it is intelligence. Individually, each data point is trivial. Compounded across millions of customers over years, it becomes something close to a superpower. Amazon built its recommendation engine, its pricing algorithms, its inventory models, and ultimately its entire retail dominance on the systematic collection and application of exactly this kind of data. They understood, earlier than almost anyone, that the company that knows its customers best wins, not the company with the most stores, or the biggest inventory, or the longest history. Borders had $4 billion in annual revenue running through its ecosystem. It had millions of loyal book-buying customers whose preferences, habits, and purchasing behavior were rich and detailed and valuable beyond measure. And it routed all of that intelligence through a system owned by its competitor. The practical implication for any business today is this. Wherever your customers are interacting with your brand, that interaction is generating data. The question is whether that data is flowing to you or to a platform, a partner, or a third-party service provider who is building something with it that you haven't thought about yet. The third lesson, comfort is not a strategy. This is the one that applies most broadly, and it is the one that is hardest to act on because comfort feels, from the inside, almost indistinguishable from confidence. Borders was not a lazy company. It was a confident one. Confident in its experience. Confident in its brand. Confident in the irreplaceable quality of what it had built. And that confidence, which had been entirely earned over 30 years of genuine success, gradually became the thing that made honest assessment impossible. The market does not reward past excellence. It rewards present adaptation. Every company that has ever been disrupted was, at some point, genuinely excellent at what it did. Excellence in the existing model is not protection against the next model. It is often the reason the next model takes so long to be taken seriously. Borders was excellent. Borders was comfortable. Borders was gone. Those three facts are not a coincidence. They are a sequence. The ruins of Borders are not just a cautionary tale for bookstores or retailers or media companies. They are a stress test that any organization can run on itself right now with the information it already has. The questions are simple. The answers, if you're honest, are rarely comfortable, which is exactly the point.